I want to use the time that's allotted to me this evening to recapitulate the first 23 verses of Genesis 1. That's what we have covered thus far down through Genesis 1:23, and then finish on out the first chapter of Genesis here, which will finish the second of 5 divisions that we are either have been or are in or will be in here in our studies on creation. That first division, the former of the two, being the introduction, and what we've been on now for several months is creation itself, and that is restricted to Genesis 1. All this, by the way, is on your outline. You see on page 2, creation deals specifically with Genesis 1. From there, I trust next week we can go on to the third of the 5 major divisions that we'll be studying. That concerns the creation of man, Adam, and the formation of Eve from Adam. That's Genesis 2 and 3. And then their posterity, Genesis 4, where you've got Cain, Abel, and Seth, and Genesis 5, which is one of the 2 genealogies, one in chapter 5 and one in chapter 11, that will concern us in our study. However, the genealogy in chapter 5, a discussion of it will probably be postponed until we get to the one in chapter 11, so we can deal with both of them together in discussing a little bit of the various theories concerning the age of the earth. Then the fourth division, Genesis 6, 7, 8, and 9. This is on page 6 of your outline. All these are your Roman numerals. If you follow along, you'll see where we're going. 6, 7, 8, and 9, these 4 chapters dealing with the flood. Then on page 8 of the outline, Genesis 10 and 11, the table of nations and the other genealogy that we find there in chapter 11. Now, most of our time has been spent thus far on creation, and in the future we'll probably spend more on the flood than either one of these other divisions, either the third or the fifth division, because those are the 2 basic things, I guess the 2 largest things to cover in Genesis 1 to 11, creation and the flood. Everything else seems to kind of build around it or undergird it. So although we'll be looking at that, we'll be looking in more detail at just the subject of creation and the flood in particular. So we want to recapitulate what we've covered thus far, giving you an opportunity to make sure that you understand what we've gone over so we can finish out creation. And I don't remember well, then we'll start next week on, we'll start on some things that we're not going to start on. And then after that, we'll cover some things that we are going to cover concerning the relationship between chapter 1 and chapter 2. So let's go back to the first verse before we get in. We've covered 5 days now. We're on the 6th day, or we will be on the 6th day this evening. Go back to the very beginning and see what we've looked at thus far. We've just covered a lot of material and already answered a lot of questions that a lot of people have. I was reading a noted theologian, I don't remember which one, but he was one of the noted ones the other day, and he made the comment in his writings that, at least as far as he was concerned, on his list, Genesis 1 would go at the very top of the most difficult chapters in the Bible to understand because, he said, and I agree with that statement, it is one of the most difficult, but he said because the Bible leaves us guessing on so many questions that simply are not answered in Genesis 1. And of course, I would differ with him there. Although questions like when angels were created and Satan and the planets and things, you won't find mentioned in that language right here in Genesis 1. If you look hard enough, You turn over enough stones, you can always find out what the answer is. It's rare that the Bible doesn't answer something. I don't know if I've ever said that it doesn't answer something. If we ever come across that, I'll tell you it's not answered. But thus far, Genesis 1, and you know, if we wrote this, what's interesting about it, we've got 31 verses. Now, think of the material that goes into books on the stars and all types of things like that, the human body. Think of the amount of material goes in there, and he could write all of it in 31 verses and not leave anything out. It's all fit in there somewhere, even if it's not mentioned. And there's, of course, no one in this room that could have described creation in 31 verses and not left anything out and have been that successful. And that grandeur, I might add, in your language, because this is a beautiful passage in Genesis 1. So it is a blessing to be able to read it and understand. The Bible says, Matthew 24, whoso readeth, let him understand. So there's no sense in reading if we're not going to understand. Well, before we start there, I want to go over one more time to Hebrews 11, because I like this passage and what it has to say about creation and the essentialness of a Christian knowing and understanding what creation is all about. That's found in Hebrews 11, verse 3. There are a lot of theories floating around, and everyone always, the best thing to do when you're accused, of course, is to accuse your accusers. And when they accuse you of not knowing what you're talking about, you just accuse them of not knowing what they're talking about. And everyone has their own theory, really all of them thinking there's really no way we can prove any of these things. There's no way from the Scriptures of actually demonstrating either the truth or the belief. But I beg to differ with that. We can determine what's true and what's false. Through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. Hebrews 11:3. And as I've said so often, the faith chapter begins with faith in the creation and the Creator behind the creation. It doesn't start with one salvation or anything else. It starts with, by faith or through faith, we understand. I don't understand these things, people say. Well, through faith we understand, and you can put your name in there if you want to, that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. In other words, what he's saying in essence is through faith we understand Genesis 1 and 2. Evidently, he recognized that it was not one of the easiest things to understand. On a superficial reading, you just read over these things, because I certainly didn't when I first read Genesis 1, nor did I when I read it the second or third or fourth time. It took more than that, and it took a little more in-depth, comparing the Word with the Word, comparing spiritual things with spiritual things, and then your eyes will be opened up. Well, back to the first verse, and we'll go over what we've covered so far and see if we've answered everything that your curiosity might ask. In the beginning, God, we spent, I don't remember how long, just on this first verse, the very first verse of the Bible here. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, you can have verse 2 changed. It's fine just the way it is, as long as you understand what it means by what it says. But if you want to have it changed, now as far as the earth was concerned, the earth of verse 1, it was unformed and unfilled. And darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Some versions give a lot of the proper words here that we've had to manually insert into the text here, although they don't really give all of the right ones. Some versions do give some of the right words slipped in here. God said, let there be light. Not the first thing that was created. We've got a lot created in verse 1. And there was light, and God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and that's not capitalized. They capitalized that, and it doesn't make any difference whether you have it or not. And the darkness he called night, and the evening was, and the morning was day one. So that wraps up the first day, the creation of the various things that we've covered in verse 1, along with an extra light source besides the sun, which is not made until down in verse 14 on the fourth day. So we've got a temporary light source that God himself has to divide in verse 4, the light from the darkness, whereas in verse 14, these more or less permanent light bearers will do their own dividing between the day and the night. Verse 6 begins the second day. And God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and divided the waters which were under the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And what was this expanse? God called the expanse heaven. Again, it doesn't need to be capitalized. They're just trying to set it off there as being what they thought the firmament, and what we know to be the expanse that he made. So you've got the waters above, and you've got the waters below. The waters below we've discussed because they are picked up in verses 9 and 10, and a further division between the waters below and dry land is made. We've not really talked too much about the waters above because we'll be coming to that later on in our study. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas, and God saw that it was good. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. And the evening was, and the morning was, day 3. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heaven, and let them divide," in other words, let them divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. So beginning with the creation, and it doesn't mean that he simply made them to appear, beginning with the creation on the beginning of the fourth day of the luminaries, we have the establishment of a regular system of time. So he says, "Let them be for seasons, for days, and years." In other words, let them be for a calendar. "And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth," and it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night, and he made the stars also. And God set them in the expanse of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And the evening was, and the morning was, day 4. Now, beginning with verse 20, we've got more changes in the text. And God said, "Let the waters swarm with swarms of the moving creature that hath soul, and let fowl fly above the earth upon the face of the expanse of heaven." And God created great sea monsters, and every living creature that moveth, with which the waters swarmed after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth." And the evening was, and the morning was, day 5. So in 23 short verses, none of them are really very long, you've got 5 days of the account of creation, leaving out some of the higher mammals in the 6th day, and especially man, who was the what we call the crowning glory of his creative acts, because it's with him he's going to be dealing in a very special and specific and unique way. So he, along with some of the higher mammals, is reserved until the sixth day. Now, concerning the sea monsters, we spent several weeks on looking at some of the animals in the Scriptures. We saw that there was such a thing as Behemoth, and there was such a thing as Leviathan. So I trust you'll remember the passages that deal with that. Now, earlier, this is way back towards the very beginning of our studies, we looked at some problematic questions, or we didn't really look at them, we just mentioned them, and we left all of that up to you to find out. I don't remember all of the ones I gave you, but I've got some down here that we've covered already. One of the things we asked was that in creating all things, did God also make gases, air, atoms, and space? That was one of the first things. We see this, now we can look at some of the answers. We see this answered for us among other places in the New Testament, in Colossians 1, which is the best text for answering this particular question. Did he make things like that? Or did he only concern himself with the large physical things like the sun and the earth and the stars and planets and so forth? Verse 16, for by him were all things created. Now you don't even need any more than that. By him were all things created. Now we're going to cover that later on here in our account this evening back in Genesis. That are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were made by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. So 4 times he makes reference to the fact that all things were made by him, which leaves out absolutely nothing. That would include everything invisible, some of those things that we can't see, as well as all of the evil and wicked, although they weren't at the time of their creation, principalities and powers. Now, another question that we haven't gotten to, that I don't even know if we will get to, concerns when they became evil, and that also is implied in Scripture, but we haven't gotten so far as to being able to cover that. Another question that we raised was, what exactly is space and how large is it? Is space infinite, which just about everyone believes it's infinite, or is it finite? And we proved in more than one way. Classic way is that this is sitting right here occupying space, nothing else can occupy the same space, which means the space is finite and not infinite. Now they've stretched out to 12 billion light years away, and they know the end of the known universe, but beyond that they feel that there's certainly got to be more. And there probably is. But where it ends, we don't know. How many billions or millions or trillions of light years away, we don't know. And what would happen to you if you ever got on the other side, we don't know that either. But we'll never be there, so there's no sense in even raising questions that are superfluous. When were the other galaxies and planets made? That is in the end of Genesis 1 and verse 16, where it says that he made the stars also. Now I can prove that this covers everything else because he is making a distinction in the first part of verse 16 between the sun, he calls it one of the great lights, and the stars that he goes on to make in verse 16. And he knew and we know that the sun is nothing but a star. So he was trying to mention only those 2 light sources that had the greatest bearing upon the earth. That would be the sun and the moon. And beyond that, it's not that important that he goes on and mentions everything. So he just said, and he made the stars also. But remember, he's already made a division between the sun and these extra things that he goes on to say that he made in verse 16. Is there life on other planets? We gave several arguments against that belief. One of the most important being that Hebrews 10 would have to be violated, where it says that Jesus died for the sins of the whole world once. But if we've got people on other planets, regardless of what type of creature they might be, he's going to have to die all over again for them too. Not only for humans, but to liberate. Remember Romans 8:19 through 22, the groaning creation that's under the bondage of destruction and decay. He'd have to be going from one planet to another and dying for those green men on Mars, or whatever color men they are on some other planet. He'd have to be dying for them afresh. Now, along with this question, we ask, does the Bible have anything to say about space travel? And for that, we can turn to Psalm 115 and verse 16. The Bible does indeed have something to say about space travel and about satellites and, well, any type of thing, artificial, man-made, that you're going to try to put in outer space. Psalm 115:16, clear enough for me. The heaven, even the heavens, are the Lord's, but the earth hath he given to the children of men. So that is their proper domain. Now, if you'll turn back to Genesis 1, we hadn't gotten this far in our reading, but it says the same thing. You might not have known it. But right here in Genesis 1 and verse 28, says the same thing as Psalm 115. Now, you might have never seen that it talked about space travel here in verse 28, but it very clearly does to those that are wanting to see. Now, people just have all types of problems with us because we believe that space travel is unscriptural, but that's what the Bible says, so all you get is too technical there. Well, what was man's purpose? Listen to this. And God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Dominion is restricted to the sphere of the earth, and of course the birds that are in its immediate atmosphere. But to stretch out beyond that is getting out in what God calls his own domain in Psalm 115:16, the heaven, and even the heavens, all of them belong to the Lord. Let's see, we raised the question, dealt with this very easily. How can we have light in Genesis 1 before the sun was made? What is the Bible's position on the gap theory? We spent several weeks on this. This was back under theistic evolutionism. Before that, we covered some of atheistic evolutionism. You might want to turn there and see if you remember these various men that are put on the universal scientific pedestal of worship to bow down before Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal and Java. And all these other men here, remember Neanderthal, he's now classified as a Homo sapien. Australopithecus is now known to be an ape. The Java man, that was the Dutch physician that thought he could find a missing link in the East Indies, and he went down there and he found some bones, but he neglected for 30 years to tell us and the world that right next to those bones he found some human skulls. The Peking man, allegedly discovered in 1930, but all of the material that allegedly belonged to this man was mysteriously lost during World War II and has never since been seen nor heard of. Very interesting about the Peking man. The Nebraska man, that was the mistaken identification for a good old hog. That was the one time, as I quoted one fella said, that was the one time that these hogs made monkeys out of the evolutionists. The Piltdown man, he is a proven hoax, and even the scientific world will admit that. Some of the other things they're not too willing to admit, but they will admit that the Piltdown man was a proven hoax. They filed his teeth down and put some acid on him to make him look a little old. He was found in Piltdown, England, in the gravel pits there. And see, people bow down and worship these things. And the Kenya man, that was what Leakey found, and I remember giving you a quote from Leakey. He says that none of these things really are man's ancestors, and he simply is baffled over the missing link of mankind. Well, that only leaves, that doesn't really leave any except for Cro-Magnon, and he doesn't present any problem at all. Well, let's assume that he did. There goes 7 out of 8 easily shot down without a lot of study or anything. I think we covered all those in one message. And everyone, the world over, and I guess especially in this country where we want to worship the God of science, if you can analyze it and put it in a test tube and weigh it and measure it, then it must be real. But if you can't see it, then don't believe it. And since we can't see the Creator, we're not going to believe in creation. But we have found some pig's teeth and some dog bones and all types of other things, and we're going to make some skeletons out of them. And bless God or bless the devil, whichever persuasion thereof, we're going to get us one of these ancient men, whatever it takes. And you see, and then we go on to Gould's punctuated equilibrium hypothesis. He admits there's no missing link. You'll never find a missing link. So what happened is all of a sudden, a mammal laid an egg and then a bird hatched out of it. The bird laid an egg and a reptile hatched out of it. And the reptile laid an egg and a whole bunch of ants crawled out of it. Why? I mean, I could invent my own theory that sounds that good. But give me some proof of that, though. Just give me one shred of evidence, anywhere, one shred of evidence for that, and they can't do it. Now, see, we're criticizing this a lot. We're not criticizing the dinosaur bones because those are real. Like I said the other week, when you find a tooth that's several feet long and it's a tooth, then there's nothing you can do with that. It's just a tooth, and you have to admit that. But when you're finding little fractures of people's skulls, and you found 2, and you're missing 10,000, and you make the rest of them out of plaster of Paris, then you've got something wrong with you there. You are worshiping a God, and it's the God of this world. It's the God of this evolutionary spirit, and you are wanting to come up with something. It doesn't matter what extreme you have to go to. You want to get one of these ancient men so you can put it on display and satisfy, I might add, the doubts that they all have in their own hearts. Because we've been looking for 100 years now for the missing link. Ever since 1859 in Darwin. I brought a picture of my favorite scientist and yours, just so you never forget what I don't know what to call him, looks like. But ever since his time now, we've been looking for 100 years for that missing link and have not been able to find it yet. It doesn't look like anything except some of his ancestors. No joy of the Lord. Now, he's supposed to be a Christian, remember. He studied in divinity school. He's supposed to be a Christian. And people, Christian evolutionists, so-called today, argue still that some of these great men of science, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, these were great Christian men. And it can be proven that these men were involved in the occult and spiritualism and a lot of other things. And this fellow right here is certainly no exception. He dropped out of school, remember. I think this article even got a picture of the Beagle, which was his ship that he traveled around as a botanist on for 5 years. This is down in the Straits of Magellan. I don't know how clearly you can see that. But this is his old ship. He got down there on those islands and started studying those different types of finches and got possessed by evil spirits, just like his grandfather was, and came up with all these things. Romans 1 fulfillment, worshiping the creature more than the Creator. God gave us the creatures so that we could see the Creator behind them, but not to make the Creator out of the creature. He is totally separate and distinct and above them. And then this old theistic evolutionist stuff, which is the most modern error that we're being confronted with, and all the various theories, most notable one being the gap theory that's being proposed and propounded and hounded and pounded by people today. Look over in Hebrews 1. You remember that the tape that you were advised to hear, the man on this particular tape made a big thing about the fact that the word foundation, the New Testament, should be translated destruction because it has as a base or root meaning a casting down. And therefore, he thinks he's found proof of the fact that there was a cataclysmic destruction between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, from the very lips of Jesus Christ himself, because Jesus talks about these certain things that have been hidden since the foundation of the world. And he says, hidden since the destruction of the world, and Jesus himself is putting his own stamp of approval upon the gap theory. But I want to show you two passages that just destroy that theory, and he should have, again, gone into a little more depth and run the references before you make such a broad general conclusion like that. One is in Hebrews 1, beginning with verse 10, which is quoting the end of Psalm 102, a creation account. Now, listen to what this says, and this really does away with his theory there. And thou, Lord, in the beginning hast laid the destruction of the earth, and the heavens are the works of thine hands. It's obviously talking about creation here, but we have to insert the word, Lord, you've laid the destruction of the earth. He's talking about laying the foundation of the earth, very obviously here. And then in chapter 4, and verse 3, one that we have mentioned previously, which stands out even as more of a sore thumb than chapter 1, for we which have believed do enter into rest, as he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the destruction of the world. And according to their theory, beginning with Genesis 1:3, we have the recreation of the earth and everything else going all the way down to verse 31. We'd have the destruction, by the way, in Genesis 1:2. But Paul clearly says that the works were finished from the foundation. Now, if we read that as they read it, or as he'd like to interpret or translate that word, it would say that the works were finished since the destruction of the world. Say that the works were finished since the destruction of the world. Then how did we get the recreation of the world then? It says that the works were already finished whenever the world was destroyed. That was the end. And they would, see, they don't know what to do with passages like this. But he never covers any of these on his cassette tape. He covers some over the Gospels and some in Revelation. And anyone that just happens to use that word in the general sense, foundation, and he wants to say, well, it could be destruction. But here's two very clear passages which satisfy that question, does it mean destruction or does it mean foundation? Because in both of these places, we clearly have a reference back to the first 3 verses of Genesis 2. And there it says that all the works were finished since the foundation of the world. Then along with that same heresy comes the question of the pre-Adamic race, which practically all of them believe. And you see, not just charismatics, but we have some leading evangelical scholars that have fallen for this deception of the gap theory. And not all, but most of them also believe that there was such thing as a race of pre-Adamic men. For that we have our answer in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. It's always good to remember these passages. And so it is written, the first man, Adam. So there weren't any men before the first man. You can't get any more first than first. So that is a total denial of the truth of 1 Corinthians 15:45 to say, yes, Adam was the first man, but there were men that lived before Adam. It's kind of like what we call reasoning in a circle. The first man, Adam, was made a living soul, which it says that very thing in Genesis 2:7. That's a quotation from Genesis 2:7. And the last man, no, the last Adam, was made a quickening spirit. And we also have a proof in Genesis 1:31 that no such destruction ever existed. When, after all that God has done in 30 preceding verses, he surveys his glorious handiwork and makes the acclamation, behold, it is very good. And it would be a little ridiculous if all of this was on a graveyard of dinosaurs and dead Cro-Magnon men for God to say, isn't this beautiful? There's a lot of rotting flesh and dinosaurs underneath what I've redone here, but isn't it all beautiful here anyway? It really wouldn't make any sense. And also in Romans chapter 5, destruction and death and misery, dear friends, came into the world in direct response to Adam's sin. And this is clearly stated in Romans 5 and verse 12, which means that we couldn't have any sin before this, and without sin, you've got no death, no misery, no destruction. Romans 5:12, wherefore as by one man, and he names him in verse 14, Adam, sin entered into the world, and death by sin. In other words, our claim is that no death existed in the world prior to Genesis 3. There was no death of any man. We only had one, and that was Adam, and there was certainly no death of any animals at that time. Death entered by sin, sin entered by Adam, and not by any group of Neanderthal pre-Adamic men. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned, beginning with their father, who is both the spiritual, the physical, and the federal head of the human race. And I guess that about does the questions that we can cover thus far on some of the earlier ones that we raised. Let's go back to Genesis 1 and pick up in verse 24 and begin looking at the sixth day of creation. We're going to finish this up this evening so that we'll have time to get started in our third major division on the creation of man and his posterity. Genesis 1 and 24. God said, let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping things, and beasts of the earth after his kind, and it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth after his kind, and cattle after their kind, and everything that creepeth upon the earth after his kind, and God saw that it was good. Now later on in chapter 2, in verse 19, we're told that the substance of the ground was used both in the formation of Adam's physical body and in the formation of the animals that God made. So in verse 24 of chapter 1, where it speaks of animals that would, of course we don't have any domesticated animals at this time. All animals were ones that could fellowship in some regard and in some respect with Adam. The mention of cattle here includes what would become your domesticated animals, the ones that man would have tamed, that he would use for pets or that he would use for food. And when it talks about other living creatures and the beasts of the earth, and that would include your lions and tigers and elephants and the things that on the whole have not been tamed and are not tamed by the average man today. The other thing that's included in verse 24 is simply called the creeping thing. Now according to Leviticus 11, this would include all of our insects. So they've been made now 3 days after plants who need insects to survive, if we really got millions of years existing between each one of these so-called days here, and probably your things like snakes and lizards and, well, whatever would you'd consider to creep upon the ground. Well, snakes not at that time, but that category of creatures, reptiles and things would probably be included here as long as they were land reptiles. Turtles and so forth. You see, you can fit in there whatever you see out in the world today. And God said, verse 26, let us make man in our image and after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Now these verses present a lot of problems that we'll begin looking at next time. Verses 26 and 27 and 28 also. So you might want to be studying those and see if you recognize the problems. But problems in more than one area, I might add, in verses 26 through 28, with the sudden introduction of man and woman, I might add, and their creation, And it uses the word create, verse 27, bara, 3 times. The only other time the word is used, of course, is back in verse 1 and in verse 21. So we've only got the word bara used 5 times here in verse 1, in verse 21, and 3 times here in verse 7, that God, male and female, created he them. So I wonder what that includes and what that doesn't include, and what that means and what that doesn't mean. And God blessed them. The second time we see his blessing. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill up the earth and subdue it. This word appears, mali, appears one more time over in Genesis 9 in verse 1, where God gives the exact same command and decree to Noah after the flood, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And the word can be translated either as fill up or as replenish. It just depends on your time reference. If there's never been anything before you, then you certainly couldn't replenish anything. If you have had things and people and animals that have existed before you, then you could translate it as replenish rather than fill up. So in Genesis 9 and verse 2, replenish is just fine. Because the earth was plentiful before this time in its men that occupied its surface and all the animals, and now he says it's time to replenish. But back in Genesis 1:28, we've never had anything existing before this time. So you certainly couldn't say replenish. That's been a stumbling block to some people, but it should be fill up. And have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. And God said, behold, I have given you every herb bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, in the which is the fruit of a tree, yielding seed, and to you it shall be for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creepeth upon the earth, wherein there is soul, I have given every green herb for food, and it was so. Now, if anything, the word shouldn't be meat, because they're just commanding here that they can't eat meat. So that's just the King James way of including all types of food there. But he's just telling them right here, you can't eat meat, you can only eat vegetation. So it couldn't be meat, it means food. Verse 31, and God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, and the evening was, and the morning was, day 6. I have brought an article along from an evangelical magazine that they published recently. The title of the article is Guidepost for the Current Debate Over Origins. And beginning the article, the subtitle, the editorial writer states, we should reject naturalistic evolution, but put our faith on the line only over those alternatives that are unquestionably biblical. Now, without going any further, you can detect that there is a little cynicism in here in this statement, that there must be a lot of alternatives that aren't necessarily unquestionably biblical, maybe in some hyper-creationist mind, but not as far as most people are concerned. I want to read you some of these things here because this is a very recent 3 months ago article. One division, they discuss, does the Bible teach the truth about science? Another division, does Scripture contradict evolution? Another division, what about the age of the earth? They make a statement, the basis for a very recent creation, and by that they mean 10,000 years or less, of the universe rests upon several different assumptions, one of which being that the days mentioned in Genesis 1 must be 6 consecutive periods of 24 hours. The most recent thing they're calling it now is the 144-hour theory. Of course, you've got 144 hours and 6 days. So they're calling it the 144-hour theory, that we believe that all this actually got here in 144 hours, which we do. 6 days, 144 hours. It went all the way, 144 hours, and everything got done. I read that in a recent article. That's what they're calling us now, the 144-hour theory. Then he goes on to say, unfortunately, this assumption is based upon a superficial reading of Genesis and related passages. A superficial reading. He said, that's our basis for believing in the 144-hour theory. You just barely read the text. The text really says something differently, but you just barely skimmed over it, and that's what you got out of it. And of course, after every single day, he's emphasizing the point. This was one day. It had 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness, and it was only one day. I mean, he emphasizes that point. And to make such a bold, demonic statement here that that's based on a superficial reading, you'd be a fool to make a statement like that. You can say we're wrong, but don't dare say that's a superficial reading. That's exactly what the text says time and time and time again. In 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, all that was therein, and rested the seventh day. Then, of course, you'll remember this from the day-age theory. He goes on to say the Hebrew word translated day, I might add, in Scripture often refers to periods of time. And that has nothing to do with what the price of cheese is in China. We're talking about Genesis 1. We're not talking about what it often means in Isaiah or Matthew. That's skirting the issue, putting up a smoke screen to say, well, now it often means this. I don't care if it 99 out of 100 times means long period. It doesn't mean that in Genesis 1. So that's a smoke screen to say, well, oftentimes it means more than just 24 hours. Which we, of course, believe that, because we've shown you a place in chapter 1 and a place in chapter 2 and verse 4, that one place, the day just referred to 12 hours, and the other place, it used the word day, and it referred to the 6-day period, the 144 hours. But that still doesn't negate the fact that after every day, he says, and there was an evening, and there was a morning, and this was day 1, day 2, day 3. Moreover, a literal reading makes it extremely difficult. Oh, I better not read that because that's something we hadn't gotten to yet. Then he says, I didn't plan that. I really didn't mean to read that. Then he says, by the way, I might add, a note in the Scofield Bible points out that it is quite possible that Genesis 1:2 describes the state of the earth when God began his first day of creative work. How long the heavens and earth may have existed before the creative work described in this chapter, we do not know. We know without question only that in the beginning God did it. Moreover, we are not told that these days were consecutive. And as I said before, there's no plainer way that he could have said it, unless he gave us Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I guess if he would have given it that way, and the days that weren't called things like that back then, that's from the Roman calendar, that's probably the only thing that would have satisfied them, is on Monday this happened, and then on Tuesday. Then you'd know he's talking about consecutive 24-hour days. Then, of course, he wants to bring in his whole truckload of scholars. He says such evangelicals as Eckelman and Newman, and there are more scientists than there are theologians, for example, argue that God began certain types of his creative work on each of 6 24-hour days, but they were not consecutive. In other words, you've again got gaps, not only after verse 1 and verse 2, but you've got gaps after every single day. You've got a literal day within long eons of time for all of this to work itself out. Another well-known evangelical fundamental writer, and I've got some of his books, and what he says on other things, of course, is just fine. He says, he's quoting this fellow, and he said, such and such, so beautifully warns us. It was to show us the Creator, this is the quote, it was to show us the Creator rather than the creation, and to teach us knowledge of God rather than physical science that Genesis 1 and 2 were written. Another smokescreen. All of Genesis 1, it's not trying to show us the Creator. It really doesn't tell us much about him. It's telling us about what he did. Day after day, it's telling us about the creation. So again, we've got such a bold, erroneous statement that Genesis 1 was not written to tell us about creation.
then why tell us about the sun and all these things? Why even go into all the detail there? Why not just teach us some on God if that's what it was supposed to tell us? Teach us some about His holiness and His love. They're so blinded to the truth. They're just so blinded to even make a statement like that. Again, if they just say you're wrong, and I don't know why you're wrong or where you're wrong, I just know you're wrong and I'm not going to believe that, that's one thing. But to make a statement like this, and you can't substantiate by anything on the contrary, the very passage that you are alluding to contradicts what you're trying to say that it says. Now I've got this underlined in red. As biblical students, therefore, we must remain agnostic about the age of the earth. So he's claiming that we all ought to be agnostic when it comes to these areas of science. As I said, that's the double revelation theory. Leave all these outside material things to the scientists. Leave the Bible to us theologians. And if we ever have a problem, then we'll bow to the scientists because they know what they're talking about. And many fall for the double revelation theory. We have no biblical warrant for ruling out the validity of the commonly accepted geological timetable. And we went over several reasons why that even if this did take several billion years, we can rule it out because you've got insects created way too late. I mean, even if the geological time scale was right insofar as telling us these took millions of years to take place, the order of Genesis 1 is backwards to the geological timetable. You'd have to reverse these things. You've got the plants before the sun. And all these other things that we've given you are just the opposite of the geological timetable. At the moment, we conclude that the preponderance of scientific evidence from geology and astronomy favors a universe 15 to 20 billion years old and an Earth with an age of 4 to 5 billion years. Then he goes on, you might as well not even be a Christian if you're going to believe things like that. One of the problems in the current debate is the tendency of, quote, creation scientists to put biblical faith on the line on the basis of an earth and universe created in the last 10,000 years or so. So he says that's irritating whenever they're making our whole Christian experience stand or fall on the fact of do we believe the Genesis account of creation, which we just read, Hebrews 11:3 says your Christianity does stand or fall on the fact of whether you believe in creation. We are not convinced that the Bible does not permit us, well, that doesn't have anything to do with it. There's another statement. Then he mentions Dr. Schultz in his book. Some of you have his book. He says Schultz, in what is probably the most widely used survey of the Old Testament in thoroughly conservative schools, writes, and he quotes, nowhere do the scriptures indicate how much time elapsed in Genesis 1 to 11. Regardless of what date man may approximate for the beginning of the human race, it is still within the scope of the scriptural account. He said it doesn't matter what date you put to it, it's still within the scriptural account. You could put 50 trillion years. And what he says is that it's still in the scriptural account. One final statement, I think. We do not consider the view, and this is their official position, we do not consider the view of an evolutionary origin for humankind as heretical so long as it fully safeguards the nature of man and woman. As long as it safeguards their nature, and I don't know how you can safeguard that and believe in evolution at the same time, but he said as long as you can safeguard their nature, he says we do not believe that the evolutionary origin of humankind, not animals, that's all right, but of mankind, we do not view this as being heretical. A contradiction to say that you can believe in evolution, but at the same time you've got to hold to Genesis 1:27 that man was made in the image of God, where if he has evolved, he's made in the image of his ancestors. Well, I want to close with several things here that we see in chapter 1, God's divine activity, God's divine pleasure, and God's divine rest. The name of God, Elohim, occurs 32 times in chapter 1 of Genesis, a remarkable fact. No other name used here in Genesis 1. We're talking about his divine activity. This is one of the chapters in the Word of God where we see God the most active. His name occurs 32 times as Elohim, most of which use his name as the subject of the sentence. What were some of his activities? Well, I'm going to give you what some of his activities were in the first chapter. First of all, we see that God moved. And I'm going to tell you how many times, and you'll be surprised how active he was. God moved one time. Secondly, God set. In all these cases, God is used as subject, and he does something. He's active here in Genesis 1. God set one time. God divided 2 times. God blessed 2 times. God made 4 times. God created 5 times. God saw 7 times. And God said 11 times. So we've got him creating, moving, saying, seeing, dividing, calling, making, setting, and blessing for a total of 32 times when his name is connected with one of these particular activities. So as I say, it's one of the chapters where we see God the most active in the Bible. From verse to verse, right as you go along, God is busy doing things. The master architect is busy working. Then we see his pleasure. 6 times the Genesis account, specifically Genesis 1, tells us that God saw what he had made and it was good. So we see the divine pleasure. 6 times in verse 4, in verse 10, 12, 17, 21, and 25. And for the final or the 7th time in verse 31, he noticed that everything was very good. So we have a God that is totally pleased with what he sees. 6 times after he made something, he beheld it and gave his decree over it that it was good. And then the final time, he looked and said, behold, everything that I've made is very good. This contrasts remarkably with Genesis 6 and verse 5, when God sees that all the things that he has made are not so good as they turned out. Chapter 6 and verse 5, and God saw, so he is looking again on his creation, the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. So just in 5 short chapters, we've gone from 6 times God saying it's good, and the 7th time saying, behold, it's very good, to God looking now in Genesis 6:5 and saying, behold, it is very bad and very evil, and I'm going to have to destroy the earth. So there never was a time like those 6 days when God looked at everything and everything was pleasing. Nothing that he saw was displeasing. Everything that he had done was exactly right and exactly perfect and exactly good. A state that we simply, regardless of how many social programs or religious programs we want to institute today, will never bring that back on the earth in our own power. It'll have to be brought back at the second advent when, behold, everything will be very good all over again. And that, of course, only covers us, those that will be living here on either the millennial earth or the recreated earth, because there'll be people spending eternity in hell that didn't exist here. So when you look at everything, it'll never be back to the way it was here in Genesis 1:31, where everything was very good. And then we see the divine rest, where God, not really resting, but he is ceasing from all of his labors, entering into a rest peculiar to him, where the works have been finished from the foundation of the world. And we see this in the first 3 verses of chapter 2, which really should be connected to chapter 1 because those 3 verses deal with the same subject. Our first toledot is found in verse 4. These are the toledot of heaven and earth. That's where another division should step in. So Genesis 2 verses 1 to 3 all fit in with the creation account because it's the 7th day and he's summing things up. Thus the heavens, notice over here now it's plural, and the earth were finished. And he's going to say all 3 times, and all the host of them. And on the 7th day, God ended his work which he had made. And he rested on the 7th day from all, there's the second time, all his work which he had made. There's the second time it says that he made things. Verse 3, and God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made. So 3 times made, 3 times all, 1 time create. This is the conclusion to the creation week. On viewing his creation, he's totally satisfied with everything, the way he's done it. He's very pleased with what he sees. And as I say, it's a state that we'll simply not get back to. And God's heart to this day is grieved over his creation. But it must have been a beautiful time and moment for the Godhead to see that everything was very good. Not that God is at the power of his creation today, but after all, he's the one that made it. And he still loves his creation, the things that he has made. But at this time, he sees that everything is very good. Therefore, he enters into his peculiar rest. He sets apart or sanctifies the 7th day to be a day of rest and to be a day of worship. That concludes creation in Genesis 1. Very long.